being I think 8 or 9 years old, trying out for getting ready for Pop Warner football the first time. Mom said I was like bungee cording myself to trees in the backyard to do like resisted sprints. I probably watched Rocky IV training montage too many times.
Barbell Shrugged. I'm Mike Blitzer here with Doug Larson, Kenny Kane, and we're up here in Orange County hanging out with Chad Wesley Smith at his home, hanging out in the backyard.
Yeah.
New spot for training.
New spot for everything. Yeah, I just moved in last week.
So we're here. We get to see everything just fresh.
Yeah, I was still trying to clean the place up when you guys drove up this morning. So
good job.
Yeah. The illusion of organization is present.
Yeah, we know all about it. Mm-hmm. No, and if people don't know who you are by your name, I'm sure they recognize Juggernaut Training Systems. And you did write this book, Scientific Principles of Strength Training, and we're going to dig into that today. I'm personally really interested in learning about what might differ between weightlifters and powerlifters, because we definitely hear both coaches from both sports make comments about the other sport, and it's, it can be confusing at times.
Yes.
So, and you are leading an organization that handles both types of athletes, so I'm curious about that.
Yeah. I think a lot of times people get caught up on methods, front squat is better than back squat, or high bar is better than low bar, or 5x5 is the best way to do everything, that type of thing. But I'm really curious from you, with this book in mind, like what are the underlying principles of strength training that apply to everyone across the board, and how to use those principles to make decisions in very specific situations?
All right.
And taking that a little bit further, as you make decisions specifically for general populations versus competitive populations, because that's where a lot of this confusion, I think, in the market can be created. So
I have to say with that one too, like we don't deal with that much really, if at all, with general population stuff. I mean, in our online coaching, there's definitely folks who don't compete, but they're still, training to raise their 1 rep max. But I'll do the best I can with that.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. How did you get started? What brought you into, I understand you were a shot putter, you were into power sports in the past. What got you interested in studying the subject and becoming a powerlifter and strongman?
Yeah, so I've always been really interested in studying the subject from, being, I think, 8 or 9 years old, trying out for, getting ready for Pop Warner football the first time. Mom said I was like bungee cording myself to trees in the backyard to do like resisted sprints. I probably watched Rocky IV training montage too many times. But I've written my own training program since I was 14 years old, more or less written my own since then. So it's something I've always been very interested in. So now more than 17 years I've been kind of training on my own accord. Through the shot put in college, was a 2-time collegiate national champion there, and through for 1 year as a post collegiate. At the same time I'd started Juggernaut, which 8-year anniversary of Juggernaut, pretty much right now.
Nice.
So still tried to throw the first year that we'd opened the gym, but working 60, 70 hours a week and then trying to train full time for an Olympic sport was challenging.
I've seen that quite a few times. People are like, I want to go to the CrossFit Games.
Yeah.
I want to win. I want to be on the podium for weightlifting. I'll open my own gym. I'm like, no. Huge fucking
Wrong
mistake.
direction.
Yeah.
So was that an aspiration to go to the Olympics?
Yeah. I had thrown an Olympic A standard at the time, which would have been for the 2000, like far enough to go to the 2012 Olympics. But America is just stacked in the shot put. We, gold and silver at the last Olympics. Any given year, we probably have 6 to 7 of the top 10 in the world, and only 3 guys go. So very, very tough team to make. I'd say equivalent of like Jamaican 100-meter sprint team. Maybe the toughest team to make for the U.S.
You'd be 10th best in the world and not go.
Yeah.
Why do you think that is? Why do you think that sport's so stacked in the U.S.?
At least compared to, like, let's say weightlifting, and I think there's a lot of parallels between throwing and weightlifting. Actually, a lot more parallels there between than powerlifting and weightlifting. Is that shot put gets early exposure. I started throwing the shot put when I was 8 years old. Almost everyone who's going to the Olympics probably started competing at the latest as a freshman in high school. So they're getting a long time of development there, where we're not quite as good in the discus, the hammer, the javelin, where hammer and javelin is later exposure, very similar issues that weightlifting faces. And I think it just lends itself to a bit broader population, like America's 2 best shot putters right now. One guy, Ryan Krauser, broke the Olympic record, 6'8", 310 pounds. Other guy, Joe Kovacs, just was silver at World Championships a couple weeks ago. He's 5'11", 290. So very wide body type range, but you get these really explosive guys, maybe a little too short to play football or whatever it was, and they're able to really excel there. But yeah, America is just it's dynasty.
Yeah.
Like oftentimes they're talking about like sweeping the Olympics or sweeping World Championships. They haven't pulled it off yet. But
one of the most difficult maneuvers I've ever had to do as a coach trainer is I went down to help at Chula Vista at the Olympic Training Center, worked with some of the U.S. members, I don't know, maybe 7-8 years ago. And I hadn't worked with athletes that size, and I was just trying to get one of them into a little bit of a posterior tilt. And it like suddenly everything that I'd been working towards as a coach was compromised, and I just felt so like I'm like just trying to like jump on him, and I'm like 160 wet, so I couldn't get any movement. And they're like, "What's this guy doing?" I'm like,
yeah, those guys are pretty freakish athletes.
Yeah.
So how did you transition out of track and field and into powerlifting?
Yeah, so as I kind of finished my track career, my coach from high school and he coached me in high school and college passed away from cancer shortly after I graduated college. So between no coach and no time, I was like, well, I'm already strong, so I can just cut half the training out, and now I just lift instead of throwing and lifting. Raw powerlifting at the time, this was October 2010, I did my first meet, was so tiny compared to what it is now. The first meet I ever did was the first ever USPA meet, which is probably the second biggest federation now. And I think it was 36 people in a high school gymnasium, San Luis Obispo. And now you can go to USPA meet every weekend within an hour drive from here, and there's 60 lifters, 90, 120. And so it was fun to kind of be on the forefront of that, and I just took to it quickly. I squatted 800 pounds my first meet. I had a very long, hard training background before that. But
I trained for 6 months, about 800.
Yeah, that's pretty common, right?
But so I just got into it, and it was fun, and just kind of took off from there.
Yeah. Did you have like a scientific understanding of how to train before that, or did you start powerlifting, get into it, and then start doing research and reading and studying?
Yes and no. I mean, I definitely thought that I did. Like I said, I did my first meet when I was 23. 24. And 24, and I'd been writing my own training at that point for 10 years. And I'd read a ton, and read all the books that everyone says that they read. Super Training, Scientific Principles or Science and Practice of Strength Training. But no one actually understands them, and particularly at that point in my career, I did not understand them. But I had been coaching, I coached high school football and track while I was in college and ran the off-season program there. So I'd been coaching for 4 or 5 years, and I was writing good enough programs for me to squat 800 pounds. But compared to the understanding I have of the training process now, is nowhere close. And I was really always a sport performance coach first, and I competed in powerlifting, but I didn't really coach powerlifting at that point. So I was sort of my only guinea pig for powerlifting training. But in the 7 years since then, I've gotten exposed to so many more people like Dr. Israetel, Dr. Hoffman, the co-authors of Scientific Principles, other lifters, my own trial and error, coaching hundreds and hundreds of powerlifters now, that the scientific knowledge base and my understanding of what is important to understand and what was sort of superfluous knowledge has grown a lot.
So when you say people don't understand the principles they get from those higher level books, like Super Training is super technical.
Yeah.
There's a lot of information in Super Training. If you've never seen that book, it's super dense. I could read that book 20 times and not feel like I got it all. And I feel like I have a pretty good understanding of kind of what's going on. I've been training for 20 years. I've got my degrees, I study constantly. So what do you mean people don't understand super training, and why do you think you understand it at a different level?
Well, the language in it is incredibly dense, and I'd say it's in English, but it's not written in human. Like it's translated Russian into English, but it's rough. And the only reason I think that I gained a better understanding of it is because I got exposed to someone, James Smith, is a phenomenal coach and consultant for a lot of high-level athletes and like tactical Navy SEAL Special Forces kind of stuff now. He was a guy who clearly understood it, and I had the opportunity to employ him for a year in 2011 into 2012 and see him put these ideas into practice, which, when you read them on the page and you have to read it over and over and over and you're trying to kind of put it together, but if you don't have my degree is in history, so without the anatomy physiology background plus understanding like statistics, physics, all these different fields, it wasn't clicking. Like I was maybe close on some stuff, but off the mark. And then I saw him do it and actually put it into programs, and I was like, oh, it's the most intuitive answer, basically almost every time. And once he kind of guided, started me down the path.
It's always intuitive after you know.
Yeah,
like,
exactly.
Oh, of course, it's so intuitive.
Yeah, and so once I saw him put it into practice, that it really clicked for me. It was like,
Right.
I've been thinking this stuff
We
so
tend to do
much.
that.
Yeah, and the programming, I have some of my old training journals, even from when I was 15, 16 years old, or when I started coaching when I was 19 and 20. And I look at the programs that I wrote, and they were so elaborate, different tempo schemes, and just, such elaborate exercise variation. I look at the stuff I write now, and it seems so simple, but it's so much more effective too.
You're not learning something new and feeling obligated to put it in your program.
Yeah.
Like I remember doing similar things. Like you learn about tempo, and it's like, I gotta do tempo.
Yeah.
All the time.
And some of that's good. Like some of that's
Totally.
you learn something new, you go try it out, you know what
Yeah.
it feels like and all that. But yeah, you can overdo it at times.
I think it's all an important part of the process for coaches, athletes, people in other fields, that time of experimentation. Because if you don't go through that, how are you ever going to understand? Well, this was good and this was bad. And I think the more important thing, and the thing we touch on a lot in this book, is why is it effective, or why is it less or more or less effective.
What are some of the major differences? So you said that if you look at a training program you wrote a decade ago versus now, it's much simpler. What are some prime examples of things that you've learned over time that we would see different in your programming now?
Yeah, one of the biggest ones would be a more strategic use of exercise variation, so a better understanding of specificity. And those are kind of two opposite sides of the same coin. When I was a shot putter, I had very, very high general strength qualities and general explosive qualities. Numbers like I had 36-inch vertical and weighed 290 pounds, and was doing stuff that would have indicated.
We're all kind of cracking up because you're so calm, and you just don't seem like the
Some
guy
people
that's
might
jumping out of the
You
ceiling.
said it's
Yeah.
nonchalant. You're like, oh shit, that's a big.
That's a big man.
Right. Some people might not know how good that is. That's a very high vertical jump, especially for someone who's approaching 300 pounds. That's that's like comparing it to squatting. Like you say, you squat 800 your first time out the gate. Like you might have more context with like, oh, that's heavy. It's the same thing with a vertical jump. Like that's a big vertical jump.
A lot of basketball players aren't doing that.
Yeah, and my senior year of college, I dunked a 4-kilo medicine ball with two hands.
Of course
off
you
like one step. So I had,
Why wouldn't you?
so,
I don't want a basketball.
so I had these really high general qualities that would have indicated I should be throwing 71, 72 feet in the shot put, but I was only throwing 64, 65 feet, and sort of the disconnect in that was this idea of special strength and understanding what really has high transfer to the sporting result. And it wasn't different bench variation, different squat variation, different types of jumps all the time, even though that has its place and it's all part of a bigger picture and process. For me, it would have been throwing overweight shots, underweight shots, tons of different rotational type of exercises. So the emphasis on specificity versus variation was off then. my understanding of a phasic structure to training. So, and this is going to be true of pretty much anyone who's, I think, young in what they're doing, is they want their result now. And it's tough to understand that I can, dig down a little bit to build a greater foundation. And in the long term, that's going to allow me to build a higher peak, a higher top to my skyscraper. But this week and next week, when I really want a PR, and this was probably thankfully before Instagram and stuff, because I think that drives that desire so much more.
Yeah, if I don't post a PR every Friday, I go into a deep depression over the weekend. And I drink my sorrows away.
And so that understanding of proper phasic structure and delayed gratification, which is probably just a life skill to be learned more so than just a training skill. I'd think that those were probably the biggest differences. I was trying to test too much then rather than build, and it was always something new, and most of those new things were too general to have the level of transfer that I needed.
So
how do you communicate that to your athletes? Because how do you explain that to a 20-year-old? Like, hey man, slow your roll. We're gonna stick with this program. Because that happens. I mean, I've had athletes where I'm like, this is your program, do it, and then they like sneak into a weightlifting class and do a bunch of jerks. I'm like, no, you're not supposed to do jerks for like 6 weeks. What are you doing? Yeah,
I think some of it, probably the biggest part of it is credibility at this point, that and almost self-selection, that the athlete is selecting me because they've watched the videos and they've read the book and they understand that, they understand like this is the way that I want to do it, so they seek me out to do it that way. And then when it's like, well, I did this to squat 970, or I had, I've had I think 7-8 guys squat over 800, 6 bench over 500, and another 7 or 8 pull over 800. And say, well, this is how this guy did it. Or even the female lifters, Marissa, world record, world champion. Kristen has the American record, and it's like, well, I have a 138-pound girl who's squatting as much as you, and she does it this way, so how about
squatting more than me? Yeah.
So I think that's probably the biggest part of it, and just explaining the process to it as well. And if they can understand, that I put a ton of thought into that process, I think it's easier for them to accept, like, this is the way to do it. I'm not just, shooting from the hip with it.
Yeah, like right here in the first half, we're covering like the development of you as an athlete and a coach, and the development of your understanding of programming, and even how to like approach the athletes. I want to take a break, and when we come back from the break, you're actually going to be teaching Doug and all of us, but Doug's going to be demoing how you teach squatting different than most.
if you're listening audio only, then we're very obviously, as Mike said, going to be posting a video where it's a demonstration, so you'll be missing out on that demonstration, and we come back from the second half, we'll be talking about the demo, and you might not have full context of what the hell just happened. So go watch the video, that way you know what's going on.
And last really cool part of the video is Chad dunks Michael into a basketball hoop at the end of the lift. It's pretty spectacular.
100%.
So I think the thing that really sets apart the way that we teach the squat and maybe differs a bit from others is there's been almost an over-cueing of cueing the weight to be back in the foot and the weight in the heel and to sit back with the hips, or to initiate the squat with the hips. But in the high bar squat and the front squat, especially as we're looking at carryover to weightlifting from a movement quality standpoint, or carryover to powerlifting in developing the strength and size of the quads, particularly in high volume like hypertrophy training blocks, we need to keep the torso as upright as possible to let the legs and the quads work to their fullest. And really the directive of the squat in terms of weightlifting is not how much can you squat, but how strong can your legs get to make your snatch clean and jerk better. And those are not quite the same thing. So as we get into the bar to squat, it's going to start with where you distribute weight in your foot and how you start the movement. So let's go ahead and get you under there. So this will hold true for the front squat or the high bar squat, and still to a large degree I coach a low bar squat for powerlifters in a similar way. So Doug should be feeling weight in his foot right at the front of his ankle through the midfoot, and because again I feel like it's been over cued to sit back in the heels, we'll tell athletes to push their big toe down into the floor. But ideally we're maintaining 3 even points of contact between big toe, little toe, and heel. And now from here, once we have that correct weight distribution through the foot, I want Doug to initiate this front squat by first bending at the knees, pushing his knee forward. And how much the knee can go forward is going to be limited, largely by his ankle movement. But the more that his knee can go forward and keep that even weight distribution through the foot and avoid the heel coming off the ground is going to be ideal. And that's why you can see some weightlifters knees way, way forward in the catch position of the clean. So we want to maintain that big toe pressure throughout the squat. And as Doug gets into the hole, this most forward knee position is going to be critical, because maintaining this forward knee position as he begins the squat and just comes up to maybe 3-4 inches above parallel is pretty key. Because go back down, as he comes up, if his knee shifts backwards, you see his hips rise faster than his shoulders and he loses that upright torso angle. At this point, his hamstrings and his low back are trying to take over in the lift, but the hamstrings and low back, go ahead and stand up. His hamstrings and low back are not well suited to act on the bar in that time. They just don't move the weight well in those joint angles. So the quads are really best suited to move the body and the weight the first few inches out of the hole. So it's critical that as he goes down again, that for as long as he can out of this hole, to maintain the forward knee position, like his knee against my hand, and then naturally his knees will shift back as he gets farther up in the lift. But again, we'll do it the wrong way. So he's going to go down, is fine, and hit the hole, and his knees shift back. His hips rise too early compared to his shoulders, or we break first at the knee, keep pressure in the big toe, keeps that forward knee position, can use his quads well out of the hole, keeps that upright torso. It's going to make his legs do the work. And if you're someone who really struggles with this, besides just the cueing of it, if your back is trying to take over in the lift because you have a relatively stronger back compared to weaker legs, front squats are a great option for that. But if you're doing front squats and this is still happening, your back is still going to be getting developed more so than your legs. So a belt squat is a real go-to exercise for that, because it totally eliminates the back's ability to move the weight, and you can train it for really, really high volumes. But yeah, just keeping pressure through the big toe, breaking first at the knee, and it's going to end up being a kind of simultaneous unlocking of the knee and hip together. Even weight distribution or slightly forward into the big toe throughout the lift, and keeping the knee forward out of the hole as long as you can.
Yeah, I think there's a good balance against what's been taught, such a hip dominant thing, and to have that concept of this is about building leg strength for the purpose of this movement versus hips.
Yeah, and even for a competitive powerlifting and low bar squat, I still think about initiating the knees and hips together. So I'm not doing this, I'm doing this, because the joint angle situation is going to be the same thing when you squat to below parallel, which you should be doing as a competitive powerlifter. No matter how much you want to use your hamstrings in that below parallel joint angle, it just doesn't work nearly as well as the quad there. So building up quad strength with this type of work is key.
And we're back, and Chad just taught Doug how to squat because Doug was totally screwing it up.
I've never squatted before.
Never squatted before.
Finally,
good.
Finally fixed.
No, one of the things I took away from that was, and it was a big reminder of squatting is you're building your leg strength. It's not, there's so much emphasis on hips. Mm-hmm. It's a good reminder to go, hey, this is all one unit, and how do we move it that way?
And just bend your knees and stand up. Not too much to it.
I mean, there's all the base fundamental mechanics of movement, but one of the points that I believe you're trying to make was, like, what are you trying to accomplish? And if you're a weightlifter and you're gonna catch, your 100% 1 rep max on your shoulders, like, you got to be vertical. And to stand up with that weight and not dump it forward, like, you can't let your butt slip back and bend over and your elbows drop. Like, you got to stay vertical and use your fucking quads to stand up without losing the weight.
Yeah, I think that's a particularly important concept to understand as you get outside of training for powerlifting or training for weightlifting. Specificity there is very easy to understand. Squat, bench, deadlift, specific to powerlifting. Snatch, clean and jerk, specific to weightlifting. But as you get into, like, athletic populations, football players, MMA, basketball, whatever it is that people get into these debates about, well, front squat is more functional than back squat or whatever, and it's functional for what? Because a basketball player's function is to play basketball. So you have to do things that are going to develop that. And these exercises are all general means to that. So I think understanding like the three principles I try and let guide that stuff is, can the athlete, effectively execute the exercise? Is their technique good enough so they're not going to hurt themselves? Can they put some weight on the bar to create some strength stimulus? And does it fit within the context of their bigger plan?
Mm-hmm. I think we talk about like just thinking about the functionality piece, front versus back squat. I mean, if you're not competing with a barbell, it's technically not functional at all.
Yeah, it's all general exercise.
Yeah.
All general exercise, but it's simple as a strength coach working with athletes. And if you have to report to a head coach and say, well, these guys improved this much, they put this much on their squat, this much on their bench, this much on their jumps, that's good, and it's good. But some of the lifting stuff, it's like it needs to be, that's a means to an end of improved movement.
Yeah.
What are some of your favorite populations to have worked with just through the years? Because you just mentioned, a variety of athletes, and obviously you're very focused on weightlifting, but outside of the weightlifting communities, what are some of the athletes that you really enjoy working with?
My real start in coaching was with football, track and field, and volleyball, and jiu-jitsu. I had a great group of jiu-jitsu guys like Romelu Barral, Kyron Gracie, like really high-level black belts, and that was just a really fun group to have so many elite guys pushing each other. But I was kind of done everything, water polo, swimming, all over the place.
Is like the UFC, the mixed martial arts, kind of like one of your favorites outside of the weightlifting community?
The MMA stuff is tough because, and it would go to something that would probably take us too off track, but the idea of program management, and this would come into play with CrossFit a lot too. You have so many different parts to deal with. If those coaches aren't communicating with each other, it becomes very, very difficult. And I think it's a mistake that CrossFitters make is they're on this weightlifting program and this endurance program and this skill program and it's all over the place. But it's like when you are going online to pull these 5 different programs down, those coaches didn't talk to each other. Right. And if they all want to go high volume at the same time, you're going to get screwed at the end of the day. And the same thing happens with MMA. If the strength coach, the wrestling coach, the boxing coach and stuff don't all talk to each other, you run into a real issue. So that kind of always made training MMA type of guys tough.
Yeah.
So,
I have a follow-up question to that.
But
yeah, what's one of the more difficult coaching situations you've been in with your more experienced lifters that pushed you? Like where you found yourself going, okay, whether it be a psycho-emotional issue or just a technical issue?
Yeah, I'd say the toughest thing I'd say is probably dealing with injuries. Trying to get guys to work around injuries, because some of Marissa's dealing with injury right now. She's the best lifter I coach, third at overall, by best lifter at IPF Worlds and world record in our weight class. And we're trying to work around this glute injury and having guys who are squatting 800, 900 pounds. Just shit starts to hurt.
Yeah.
And being able to find solutions that can keep them engaged mentally, while also progressing or at least maintaining physically, and then being able to sort of pivot their goals. Like, okay, well, your elbows beat up, so the bench training's got to get put on the back burner a little bit. We can create this solution, whether it's reduced range of motion or slingshot or whatever it is. Well, now we can put more attention to this other part of things, more deadlift, more squat attention, whatever it is.
You listed off a variety of sports that you've coached, and that's based on the fact that you can coach that many sports is because you understand the underlying principles. What are some principles that most people are overlooking, you think?
It might not be so much overlooking as it is incorrectly prioritizing. So, in our book, Scientific Principles of Strength Training, we go through it in order, and first is specificity. And specificity is going to create the framework within which all other decisions are made. Because you could make a lot of, smart training decisions, but if it's you could make smart training decisions for a triathlete that are terrible for a powerlifter, or vice versa. So if you don't take, and that's obviously an extreme example, but if you don't take specificity into consideration, that's going to be a big problem. So I think that a lot of people will take individual differences which is our seventh and final principle, and put that up near the top. Everyone wants to think they're a special snowflake, and that kind of training doesn't work for me. Is wrong to think that, because it's not that the training is going to differ so much by type from person to person, different weight classes, different levels of experience, male to female, drug use to drug-free type of stuff. It's going to vary much more by magnitude of training than by type of training. But I think everyone wants to think that they need this special exercise, but the individual differences tend to be fairly minute, detailed changes.
Is it possible to take specificity too far? Like having done MMA and jiu-jitsu and wrestling for a long time, I've heard people in those various sports say, well, I'm never going to do a 1 rep max in a fight. Why do I need to do a 1 rep max in training? Like, it's not a raw strength sport.
Yeah.
Which there's some rationale there, but there's also a lot of rationale the other way too.
Yeah, I think people take specificity too far all the time, because they latch on to the idea that specificity is the number one principle, and so then they violate other principles down the road. Most likely fatigue management is going to become the issue there. For a powerlifter or weightlifter, if they are specificity, well, what's that mean? 1 rep max, squat, bench, deadlift, 1 rep max, snatch, clean, jerk, front squat, and that's all they do. They're going to miss out on they're probably going to become overtrained. They're going to miss out on variation and how variation can help them avoid adaptive resistance, meaning the longer you do something, the less effective it becomes over time. And they're going to miss out on the benefits of a phase potentiation, a phasic structure of training, meaning taking one phase of training to increase the potential of the subsequent phase. And the way that we do that for powerlifting is hypertrophy strength peaking. We build a bigger muscle, then teach that bigger muscle how to produce more force, then teach that bigger, more force producing muscle the technique of the 1 rep max and the neural qualities that come along with it, and infinitely repeat that process in different proportions based on the athlete's different levels.
So that's more the art of coaching and programming, is like how to take all these fundamental principles and how much of each one to be using at any given time based on the outcome you're trying to achieve.
Yeah, and I think art is an important word to it, because the last couple of years, there's so much trending towards evidence-based practice, and all that stuff is great, and studies and stuff are certainly very helpful to inform the training process, but the human body is such an incredibly complex organism, and then you put the complexity of the athlete's life on top of that, and they're out of gym stress, their intrapersonal differences in recovery abilities, whether that's changes in diet, changes in sleep, changes in stress from work, significant other, school, whatever it may be, and that's always going to be kind of that constant ebb and flow of stuff where the principles don't change, but again, the magnitude of their application does.
Okay, so specificity was the first major principle. You sprinkled in a couple other things, but like what would be like good number 2 and 3?
Yeah, so going down the line, specificity number 1, number 2, overload. The principle of overload is going to dictate that training is training significantly stimulating enough? Is it hard enough to drive adaptation? If it's too light to make you stronger, if it's not voluminous enough to increase work capacity or increase muscle size, if it's not heavy enough to drive neural adaptation, and the timing of all these different things is certainly appropriate. And then the training must become harder over time. If you bench 300 pounds right now for one, doing 300 for one 3 months from now, 6 months from now, a year from now, well, how is that going to get you to 315? You have to be increasing some of those qualities, more volume, more weight on the bar. You can get into things like density of the training, for other sports, velocity and whatnot. Of course, technical adaptations along the way. And then after that, fatigue management. Hard training is great. Hard training is very important. Smart training is very hard training. But if you just push, what's going to be eventually the end result of that? Either running into these issues of too much directed adaptation, where you've done the same thing too long and it loses its effectiveness, overuse, injury, staleness, the recovery process, and is going to catch up to you, or the failure to recovery is going to catch up to you, and you're going to get to the point where you need to deload, and deloads and light days are of course important to fatigue management, along with recovery adaptive strategies, whether that's massage, active release, Graston, ice baths, contrast shower, all that stuff on top of proper diet and nutrition, or proper diet and sleep. And if someone's doing those three principles really well, they're going to have a very, very good program. And something like the Bulgarian system does those three things, the first two things exceptionally well. The third thing, not so great, but there are ways to sort of circumvent, ways to pharmaceutically circumvent some of the fatigue management issue to sort of help out with that. But if people are nailing those first three, they're doing a great job.
I was just going to say, these principles seem to overlap. I know you've really worked with competitive populations, but these are principles I think that are very useful for non-competitive athletes. I think these are like kind of universally sound.
Oh, I totally agree with you, and thank you. And I think with the non-competitive population or general population, the first thing, specificity, is what's changing. It's whatever you put in as your goal for the general population, lose weight, build muscle, be able to stand up paddleboard better, whatever it is, then that goal is going to frame the decisions down the line from that.
Can I hire you to make me a better stand-up paddleboarder?
I'd have to do some research.
Would that be like the strangest thing? It's like, oh, what's Mike doing now? Well, Chad's coaching him on paddleboarding. I think we should do that just so it's a thing.
Well, I'll have to do some research on that one.
And then we can do drug testing.
He's recovering too quickly.
He's the first person disqualified for international paddleboarding for drug use. So, Coach Chad, how do you answer that one? Well, I wasn't with him all the other hours of the day.
Tainted supplements, always.
So we had specificity
overload. It was so I could perform better in the bedroom. I was taking the pills from the gas station.
That's something I would pay more money for than paddleboarding. Bedroom performance with Chad Wesley Smith.
That'd be a better selling book, I think. But yeah, so going through the list, were specificity, principle of overload, fatigue management. Then the next one is SRA, stimulus recovery adaptation, which is really just a fancy way for me to sound smarter than I am by describing the training process. You introduce a stimulus, and then your body has to have time to recover and adapt to that. The different lengths of that recovery and adaptation process is what's going to kind of dictate, optimal frequency for that athlete. Different lifts, different physical qualities are going to have a different length SRA curve. As I draw my kind of air graph, we introduce the stimulus, fatigue is generated from that, you recover and adapt to slightly improve levels of what you had before, and then you do it again. If the time becomes too long, you go up and then you start to become detrained again. If the time's too short, you're not recovered enough and you haven't improved the abilities, you're training too frequently for that. You go from SRA to the principle of variation. And I said variation and specificity, kind of two sides of the same coin. Variation is obviously very important because it's going to avoid staleness. It's going to, different phases of training are going to be better suited for different types of exercises because of the goal of that phase shifting a little bit. Like for powerlifters, high bar squats may be a better option during hypertrophy training, where you're going to be doing low bar squats and peaking because that's what you do in competition, but high bar squats can tolerate more volume, going to build up more leg strength, isn't going to interfere with the deadlift training quite as much. So variation has its place, but you can't prioritize variation over specificity. Then the next one would be...
Do you think about variation as something you do within a range of specificity? Like your range for specificity is this big, and then you can vary within that range of specificity?
Certainly, and that's going to take the individual into account a lot, because the degree of variation, that spectrum of exercises that we may use for 30-year-old world elite powerlifter is still fairly small. Their greatest variation is probably tens in the high bar squat or front squat, because their most specific thing is one in knee wraps, low bar, back squat, where a less experienced athlete would have a greater range because more general training and more general movement qualities are going to be beneficial to them, all the way down to a youth training situation, which is going to broaden things even further. And the one that really drove that home for me a couple of years ago, I was at a seminar in LA with Ilya Ilyin, and in it he talked through the translator about he started training for weightlifting when he was 6 years old. He was like hyperactive, so his mom would send him to the weightlifting club with his brother, and he, quote, I would run around the gym and do all the exercises. And I don't think that 6-year-old Ilya just had free reign of the Kazakh weightlifting gym, but to me, in understanding and having read about the process of acquiring sports mastery and Soviet long-term training strategies, that meant he did gymnastics, swimming, calisthenic drills, track and field type of drills, throwing, jumping, sprinting, along with a ton of weightlifting drills. And then as he got older and older, until the final parts of his career, where he was essentially doing Bulgarian training and maybe some work from blocks, that training became, he cut out some exercises, or left them just to different parts of the year. That he would have like a 3-month part of the year where he only did the lifts once a week, he said, and he would swim and play basketball and sort of refresh himself with very general training at that point.
Yeah, I think that's something to note is people look at Bulgarian and they have a 2-year training history.
Yeah.
And then they want to do that program because it produces this athlete.
Yeah.
They don't remember that at 8 years old,
Yeah.
you have to have been this physically active, and the average American is probably not the case.
Yeah, and that's Bulgarian system, Smolov, Sheko, a lot of these programs, even looking at my training, Marissa's training, whatever it is, these really, really elite lifters, they're looking at what they do now rather than what they did to get there. Like Marissa, for example, she started gymnastics, 7, 8 years old, doing that until she was 15 or 16, and then had, a 20-ish year-long hypertrophy block of bodybuilding and physique training.
Right.
So it's like,
That's key,
we can
the
do
20-year block.
we could do very specific training now because of this massive base. But someone who's follows this elite lifter on Instagram and I want to do what that person does. Right. They're missing out on some very important parts of the process.
I love your yard. You're hoarding all the avocados. You're hoarding all the avocados in California.
I hear there's a shortage this year.
There's a shortage.
Yeah.
You got helicopters over that too. But you've got 2 trees.
I do.
You just moved in. Do you have a plan for these avocados?
There are hundreds on this one right now. So.
I was looking up into one of them, and they were just everywhere.
Yeah. I guess they were supposed to be ripe in like October, I was told by that.
Perfect.
So.
Well, now you're going to make all your money with avocados because they're like
That's
$15 a pop right now, I think.
You got a good backup plan.
Yeah.
If Juggernaut falls through anytime soon.
Totally, you can join the Mexican cartels.
Thanks for joining us today, and thanks for having us down or up. Depends on where you came from.
Yep.
Because Kenny came down, we came up.
There you go.
But one of the things I really enjoyed today was the fact that the more experienced you've become, the more simple the focus is becoming on, these are like the 3 top training principles, and programming is getting simplified and things like that. And so I think it's really great for people who are coaching and programming to hear that.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's a good reminder of the basics. I came out of the world of strength conditioning before I kind of got into the functional fitness space, and I don't hear as much about the core foundational principles nowadays than I used to when I was back even in college, 10 or 15 years ago. So it's a good reminder of some of those principles.
Yeah, I think for me, Chad, like a real big walk away is a word you mentioned earlier, which is intuition. And the development of people's intuition as it relates to coaching and helping a variety of populations takes a lot of work. So there has to be enough of an intellectual background to support that, and there has to be enough like trial and error, experimentation, and then also that like relational quality. But that's hard to achieve, but I really appreciate that idea of intuitive development as it relates to this stuff.
Well, cool, guys.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for having me on.
Yeah, where can people find more about you?
JTSstrength.com is the main spot. Juggernaut Training Systems YouTube, and then for myself, Facebook and Instagram at Juggernaut Training or at Chad Wesley Smith. Filling up your news feed all day.
You got
and
a couple books here you should check out.
Also, my book, A Thoughtful Pursuit of Strength, a book I co-authored, Scientific Principles of Strength Training, and even our own podcast with me and Max Montana, the Jug Life podcast.
Nice.
So check that one out as well.
What up? All right. Make sure to go over to iTunes, 5-star review, positive comment, and if you didn't figure it out yet, This is also on video. We've got special videos that isn't going to be in the audio version. Go over to YouTube, hit the subscribe button so you get updated every time.
Yeah. Thanks, Chad.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
Chad.